She had read the notice 3 times before she answered it. The paper was 2 weeks old by the time it reached her, passed along by a woman at the church who said she thought it might suit. She didn't say suit what exactly, but she folded it and put it in her coat pocket and carried it home. And that night she unfolded it on the kitchen table and read it again by the light of a lamp that needed trimming. Seeking a capable woman for a working household. Oregon Territory, Rimrock County. Respond in care of Dunfield Post. That was all. No age given. No name. No mention of pay or terms or what capable was supposed to mean in that particular context. She read it a 3rd time and then set it on the table and went to bed and lay awake for a long time looking at the ceiling. She had been in Spokane for 11 months. Before that, 2 years in Billings. Before that, a place she didn't talk about anymore. She had a room above a laundry and a job mending harness leather for a saddler who paid her 3 days late every week and never apologized for it. She had enough money to last until spring if she was careful and didn't get sick. Spring was 4 months away. She wrote back in the morning. The train ride was 9 hours, and she spent most of it watching the country change. The mountains got closer, and then the mountains were all around her, and then they opened up into something different, wider and colder looking, the hills dark with pine, and the valley still carrying the last of the season's dry grass. She had 1 bag. She had a hat she'd bought used, and a coat she'd had for 6 years, and a pair of boots that had been resoled twice. She did not have a return ticket. The station at Dunfield was a single building with a potbelly stove and a station master who barely looked up when she came in. She asked where she could find the post office. He told her it was the building with the blue door, 3 blocks north, and then he went back to whatever he was doing. Outside, the air had teeth. It was early October, and the sky above the ridge was the color of pewter. She stood on the platform for a moment and looked at the street, mud-packed, wagon-rutted, lined with false-fronted buildings that had been put up fast and hadn't been painted since. A dog crossed the road without hurrying. A woman in an apron stepped out of a doorway, shook something, went back inside. She picked up her bag and walked north. The man at the post office was not who she expected, which was foolish because she hadn't known what to expect. He was standing at the counter when she came in, and he was talking to the postmaster, and he stopped when the bell over the door rang. He was taller than average, broad through the shoulders. His hands, when he turned to face her, were the kind of hands you couldn't miss. Rough-scarred, dark with old work, the knuckles thick. He wore a canvas jacket and a felt hat, and he looked at her the way a man looks at something he's trying to get an accurate measure of. She said she was there in response to the notice. He said his name was Drummond. Said it the way you say a word you've said so many times it stopped meaning anything. Flat, habitual. She told him her name. He nodded once. He said, the road out to the property was about 20 minutes by wagon, and if she was agreeable they could go now, before the weather came in. She said that was fine. He held the door open. The road climbed out of town and then ran along a ridge and then dropped into a valley that was half open meadow and half dense timber. The wagon creaked. The horse was a brown mare with 1 white stocking and a calm temperament. He drove without talking, which was fine with her. She watched the country and tried to get her bearings, where the road went, where the timber broke, which direction the mountains ran. After about 10 minutes, she asked what kind of work the property ran. He said timber contract mostly, some cattle on the side. He had a crew that came in for the contract work and went home at night. The house needed somebody who could keep it running while he was out. She asked if there were other people on the property. He said no, just him and whatever crew was on at the time, and the crew didn't stay. She nodded and didn't say anything else. The house came into view around a bend. A long, low structure with a covered porch on the front and a woodpile stacked to the eave of the outbuilding beside it. Behind it, maybe 50 yards back, was a larger structure, a barn by the shape of it, and beyond that the timber started in earnest. Smoke was coming out of the chimney, thin, barely there, the kind you get from a banked fire left alone all day. He stopped the wagon in front of the porch and got down, and she got down on her side without waiting for a hand. Inside, the house was cold in the way that a fire alone can't fix, the deep cold that gets into the walls when a place isn't lived in properly. The main room had a table, 4 chairs, a cook stove that was doing its best with what had been given, and a shelf of mismatched goods, 2 tins, a sack of flour, some dried beans, a coffee pot. The floor had been swept, but not recently. There was a window on the south wall, and the light through it was flat and gray. He showed her the back room. A narrow bed, a washstand, a hook on the wall. He said it was hers if she wanted to stay. She looked at it for a moment. She said she'd need to know the terms before she could answer that. He said fair enough. He told her what he could offer, room and board and a monthly wage, modest but real. He said he wasn't looking for anything beyond what the notice described, a capable woman to keep the house. He'd had a housekeeper before, and she'd left in August, and he hadn't been managing it well since. She asked what happened to the housekeeper. He said her mother took sick and she went home to Medford. He said it without any change in his expression, and she believed him. She said she'd stay. She found out what she was working with over the next 2 days. The cook stove needed new blacking, and the flue wanted cleaning before winter. The pantry had enough for about a week if she was careful, and needed restocking badly. There was a root cellar under a trap door in the kitchen that held potatoes, some beets, 2 crocks of something she decided was pickled cabbage. The well was on the south side of the house, and the water was cold and good. The woodpile was adequate for now, but not for February. She made a list. She had a habit of lists. It was how she organized the difference between what existed and what needed to exist. She put the list on the table the second morning when he came in for breakfast. He looked at it. He looked at it for longer than she expected, which made her think either he was a slow reader or he was taking it seriously. He said he'd take her into Dunfield on Friday to get the supplies. She said that would work. He sat down and she put coffee in front of him, and he drank it without fuss. That was their first real exchange, such as it was. The crew started coming in on Monday. 3 men, Rudd and Pell's brother, and a younger man they called Stitch on account of a scar that ran along his jaw. She didn't learn their actual names for a week. They came in before dawn and went out and came back at dusk with sawdust on their jackets and a particular kind of tiredness that had weight to it. She made food for the table and they ate it and thanked her with the automatic politeness of men who had been raised to say thank you and didn't think too hard about it. Rudd was the talkative one. He had opinions about the weather, the timber contracts, the price of everything since the railroad changed its rates. He talked while he ate, which was a habit she had never loved but tolerated. Pell's brother, his name turned out to be Wendell, was quiet and ate fast and always offered to carry things if she was carrying something. Stitch watched everything with a sharp, sideways attention that she noted but didn't make anything of. He, Drummond, sat at the head of the table and mostly listened. He asked questions sometimes, how the cutting had gone, whether the skid road was holding, what the weather looked like higher up. The men answered him directly and completely. She noticed that, the way they answered him. Not out of fear, but out of a kind of respect that had been earned over time. She noticed a lot of things she didn't say anything about. On the 8th day, it rained for 36 hours straight. The crew didn't come in. He went out anyway, in the gray early morning, with a hat pulled down and a coat she wouldn't have wanted, and came back 3 hours later wet through and carrying a length of chain he'd apparently needed for something. He hung the coat by the stove and went to change, and she put more wood in the firebox and didn't say anything about the puddle he'd left on the floor. When he came back, he stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her for a moment. He asked if the roof had leaked. She said there was a small one over the back room, left corner. She'd put a pot under it. He said he'd see to it. She said she knew he would. He poured himself coffee and stood at the window and looked out at the rain coming down on the meadow. She kept working. She was making bread, the dough at the turn and fold stage. And after a while, the kitchen had the particular quality that a kitchen gets when 2 people are in it being quiet together and it's raining outside. She hadn't experienced that in a long time. She didn't think about it directly. Just noticed it the way you notice when your body stops bracing for something. She had been there 3 weeks when she went through the drawer in the main room looking for a candle and found a photograph. She didn't snoop. She wanted to be clear about that, even just to herself. She had pulled the drawer open because she'd seen him take candles out of it once, and she needed one now. But the photograph was right there, on top of everything, and she looked at it before she could decide not to. A woman. young, maybe 20, with her hair up and a serious expression. Not unfriendly, just serious. The kind of expression you wear when someone tells you to hold still and you're doing your best. She put it back. She found a candle. She closed the drawer and went back to what she was doing. That evening he came in and she had supper ready, and they ate with Rudd and Wendell, Stitch having gone home that afternoon for a family matter. Rudd talked about a problem with one of the skid roads. Wendell ate methodically and was finished before anyone else. She cleared plates and poured more coffee, and the conversation moved on to other things. She didn't ask about the photograph, but she thought about the serious expression and what it takes to maintain one, and what you lose when you can't anymore. November came without ceremony. The first frost was a hard one. She woke before dawn to a silence that had a different quality than usual. Heavier, more absolute, and looked out the window and saw everything white. Not snow yet, just frost, but enough to change the way the light worked. The meadow looked like something drawn in charcoal. She built the fire up and started coffee and stood at the kitchen window while it came light. Behind her, she heard him moving. The boards of the hallway had a particular voice. She had learned which steps said what. And then he came into the kitchen already dressed, hat in hand. He looked at the window, then at her. She said first frost. He said yes, said he'd seen it, said the high road would be icing over by afternoon, and he'd told the crew to come in early or not at all today. She said she'd make extra. He said that would be good. He sat down. She poured coffee without being asked, because she knew by now when he was about to sit down and how long it took him to get to the second cup, and at what point in that interval he wanted more. These were the things you learned when you lived alongside someone in a working household. They were not intimacies exactly. They were just knowledge, the kind that accumulated quietly and without intention. Still, she had noticed herself paying attention. That was the honest version. The situation arrived on a Tuesday in late November, as situations have a tendency to do. Without warning, on an ordinary day, in the middle of something mundane. She was at the supply store in Dunfield, waiting for the man behind the counter to finish with the woman ahead of her, when she heard her name. Not her full name. Just what people used to call her, shortened, the way someone calls you something when they've known you a while. She turned around. It was a man named Aldous, the husband of Mrs. Aldous, who'd been her neighbor in Billings. He was a large man with a red face and an expression she knew well. The expression of a person who thinks they know something about you and is deciding whether to use it. He said, well, of all places. She said hello. He said he was up visiting his wife's cousin, had been for a week. He said he'd wondered what became of her after she left Billings. He said it with a particular emphasis on left that she recognized. She said she'd moved on. She said it pleasantly, the way you say something you intend to end the conversation with. He said he supposed she had. He looked around. She knew he was looking for whoever she was with, clocking her situation, doing the arithmetic that people like him always did. She bought her supplies and left. On the wagon ride home, she sat with the parcels in her lap and watched the road, and did not let herself think about it directly. That was how she handled things. Indirectly, at an angle, until she'd worked through it enough to put it somewhere that didn't interfere with what she needed to do next. She had left Billings because a man had died, and she had been present when he died, and the way people told the story after didn't match what had actually happened. She had stayed long enough to know that the story was going to keep changing in ways that didn't favor her, and then she had done what she had learned to do. She had packed her bag and moved on. She was tired of moving on. She didn't say anything about Aldous when she got home. She put away the supplies and started the midday meal, and listened to the house around her. The tick of the stove, the sound of the horses in the yard, the particular way the wind worked at the north corner of the building. She had been here 6 weeks. It was the longest she'd stayed anywhere in 3 years. He came in at noon, and she put food in front of him and sat down with her own plate, which she'd started doing sometime in the 3rd week without making a decision about it. He hadn't said anything. The crew had adjusted to it without apparent difficulty. They ate. Outside, the wind had picked up. After a while, he said, "There was a man in town this morning. Said he knew you." She looked up. He said, "Red-faced fellow, gave his name as Aldous. Said he had some things to tell me about the woman keeping my house." She set down her fork. He said, I told him I wasn't interested in what he had to say about anybody behind their back, and that he should say it to your face if he had something to say. She looked at him. He said, I don't know what he was going to tell me. I don't need to. He had the look of a man who talks too much about other people's business, and I've known enough of those to have a policy about them. She was quiet for a moment. She said, the man in Billings, whose death I was there for, he was my employer. He had a heart seizure in the kitchen where I was working. I went for help. The story that went around afterward said I'd done something to cause it, which I hadn't. He listened. He didn't say anything while she talked. She said, I've been moving since. Not because I'm guilty of anything, but because once a story like that gets going, it's easier to leave than to stand in front of it. He was quiet, she said. I understand if that changes things. He said, it doesn't. He picked up his fork and went back to eating outside. The wind found a gap in the eaves and made a low sound through it. She picked up her fork too. December was cold in a way she hadn't been prepared for, which surprised her because she thought she had been cold before. This was different. The kind of cold that was not dramatic about itself, just total and persistent, present in the morning and present all day and present when she built the fire up at night. She stopped thinking of it as weather and started thinking of it as a condition, the way you think of altitude or ground hardness. Something to factor in. She learned things she hadn't known she was learning. That green wood, even split, didn't burn right in this stove. That the north-facing root cellar kept things better than she'd expected, and that she should check it twice a week. Not once. That the mare, whose name she'd learned was Ruth, had a habit of standing at the fence in the afternoon and watching the road. Not because anything ever came down it at that hour, but because Ruth had her own opinions about what deserved attention. She found herself talking to Ruth sometimes, in the early afternoon on the days when the crew wasn't in and the house was very quiet. Not long conversations, just a few words, the way you mark the fact that you're not entirely alone. She told Drummond about Ruth's fence habit one evening when he asked why she looked like she was thinking about something. It came out before she'd decided to say it, which was happening more often lately. He listened. He said Ruth had done that since she was a filly. He didn't know why. She said she figured it was just a form of optimism. The idea that something worth seeing might come down the road. He looked at her for a moment. He said, maybe. It wasn't much of an exchange. But she turned it over for a while afterward, the way you turn over something small that has more weight than it looks. The week before Christmas, Rudd's wife sent a basket. Dried apples, a tin of molasses, some hard candy wrapped in paper. Rudd brought it in on Thursday morning and set it on the table and said his wife wanted her to have it, and the way he said her was specific, was directed, was aimed at where she was standing at the stove. She thanked him. He said his wife had asked after her. Said his wife had wanted him to pass along that, if she ever wanted company on a Sunday afternoon, there was a standing offer. She said to thank his wife for her. He said he would. He went back out, and she stood at the stove for a moment with the basket in her hands and thought about the fact that someone had thought of her. It was such a small thing. And yet she stood there holding it for a beat longer than was strictly necessary. And when she set it down, she was careful about it, the way you're careful with things that matter and you don't entirely want to admit matter. Christmas Eve was a quiet night. The crew had gone home. The weather was clear for once, cold but still, and after supper she and Drummond sat in the main room, her with mending in her lap, him with a book he turned pages in occasionally. The fire was good. Outside the sky was full of stars, which she knew because she'd looked out the back window before sitting down. He asked, after a while, where she was from originally. She said Minnesota, a town most people hadn't heard of. He said what had brought her west. She considered how much of that answer she actually wanted to give. She said she'd had a sister in Billings and had come out to be nearby. She said the sister had died 2 years ago, and she'd stayed on because leaving felt like another kind of loss she wasn't up for at the time. He was quiet. She said, where are you from? He said Eastern Pennsylvania originally. He said he'd come out 15 years ago, more or less. She asked if he'd come alone. He said no. He said his wife had come with him. He said she died of fever in the 3rd winter. He said it without self-pity, the way you state a fact you've lived with long enough that it no longer requires any particular voice. She said, the photograph in the drawer. He said yes. The fire settled. Outside, nothing moved. She stitched and he turned a page, and that was the whole of it. But something had shifted in the room the way things shift when two people tell each other true things and no one flinches. She thought after that about what it meant to stay somewhere. Not just to remain in a place. She'd done that plenty of times out of inertia or lack of options, but to actually stay. To allow the possibility that this might be the thing you stay for. She had spent 3 years being movable. She had been practical about it, necessary about it. She had told herself the appropriate things, that stability was a luxury, that roots were a liability, that the woman who keeps her bag packed is the woman who has options. All of that was true, more or less, and none of it had made her anything but tired. In January, the crew came back from the holiday, and the work resumed its rhythm, and she found herself thinking less about what might go wrong and more about what was actually in front of her, the frost patterns on the kitchen window in the morning. The way Ruth moved in the cold, more deliberate, more careful. The way the house smelled different now than it had in October. Wood smoke and cooking in use, the smell of a place where life was happening. She had done that, or been part of it, which amounted to the same thing. February brought a storm that lasted 3 days. The crew stayed home. The road in and out was buried. She and Drummond were the only people on the property. And the snow came down steady and the wind came with it, and the house contracted, the way houses do when the world outside gets serious. She baked bread because flour was what they had in quantity. He shoveled a path to the barn twice a day, which she could see him doing from the kitchen window, his shape moving steadily through the white. She kept water hot. She kept the fire from going out. On the second day, he came in from the barn and stood in the kitchen dripping, and she handed him a towel before he could look for one. He took it. He looked at her. He said, "I want to say something." She waited. He said, "I put that notice in the paper because I needed someone to run the house. That was the honest reason. But I want to be honest about the other reason too, which is that he paused, chose a word. I was diminished by the loneliness of it, by not having anyone to account for. I wasn't managing it the way I should have been." She said she understood. He said, "I know you came for the wages and the room. I know that was a practical arrangement and I've tried to keep it that way." She said he had. He said, "I don't know what you want. I'm not asking you to tell me if you don't know. But I want you to know that whatever you decide about staying, after winter, when the road opens up again, it won't be because I've made it difficult to leave. If you want to go, I'll have a fair amount ready and a letter of reference that says exactly what you've done here, which is more than anyone had a right to ask." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "And if I stay?" He said, "Then you stay." She said, "That's not a very persuasive answer." He said, "No. I suppose it isn't. I don't have much experience with persuading people. I know how to work and how to keep my word and how to be straight with a person. That's what I have." She thought about that. She said, "Those are not small things." He didn't answer right away. She watched the towel in his hands, the way he turned it. She said, "I'm not leaving." He looked at her. She said, "I'm not saying it because the road is buried. I'm saying it because I've been deciding it for a while, and I know when I've decided something." The road opened in early March. Rudd came back, and Wendell and Stitch, and the work started up again, and the house filled with the noise of it. Boots on the porch, voices at the table, the creak of the wagon going out in the mornings. She cooked for all of them and kept the fire and tracked what the pantry needed and went into Dunfield on Fridays. It was the same as it had been, except it wasn't, in the ways that mattered. The ways that you don't necessarily see from the outside, but that you feel in the particular quality of an ordinary morning. Coffee before the crew arrived. The table in the kitchen where she spread her list and where he stood reading it before he told her what he could add. Ruth at the fence watching the road. One afternoon in March, she was in the yard when Rudd's wife, her name was Florence, and she had become a fact of the Sundays now, came in through the gate with a jar of something, and they stood talking in the pale spring light for half an hour about nothing in particular. The winter just ended, the road conditions, whether Stitch was going to stay on through the season. Florence said she'd heard a family was moving onto the Henner property, said there might be more neighbors by summer. She said that would be good. Florence said, "You're staying then?" She said she was. Florence said she was glad. She said it like someone who meant it and wasn't working up to anything else. After she left, She stood in the yard for a while. The sky had that particular quality it gets in early spring, enormous and pale and full of the idea of something about to begin. The timber beyond the barn was still winter dark, but the meadow was starting to show green at the edges. She could hear the creek from here, still running high from the snowmelt. She had left a lot of places. She had left them and not looked back, which she had thought was strength, and which she now thought might have just been practice. A habit she'd built because she'd needed it, that had outlasted the need. She was done with it. Not the way you're done with something when someone convinces you to stop. The way you're done with something when you've set it down yourself and noticed your hands feel better without it. Inside, she could hear him moving. The particular sound of the hallway, the boards she knew by name now, the second one from the left that always spoke first. She went back inside. The door closed behind her, and the warmth came up around her, and there was coffee still in the pot, and the afternoon was long, and she was, for the first time in a long time, in no hurry at all.